Now, as I already mentioned at the introductory seminar, in my case, I had a learning curve. I didn't know how to really build a business other than what the seller trained me in. He trained me how to run the business from the inside. And I spent 2 years building the company, and I was very frustrated because after 2 years of very hard work, I had only built up the business 25%. In other words, 2 years later, it was doing 25% more than when I bought it, which was reasonable growth. But the irony of it was, it wasn't fast enough because when I first got into the business, in 3 months, I went from 0 sales in the motorcycle parts business to almost $1 million in sales in the motorcycle parts business, from 0 profits in the motorcycle parts business to $100,000 of profits in the motorcycle parts business. I did that in 3 months by buying this company. And then I spent the next 2 years, and all I increased in sales and profits was 25%. And the thought dawned on me that if I'm going to develop a strategic plan for building up my company, then the way to develop the plan is not to do it by working hard to build up the business from the inside, but rather to build the business by acquisition, by acquiring other companies and adding them to my company so that I can grow in multiples the same way that I got into this business in the first place. And that's what I then started to do. Now, at the point that I decided that I wanted to grow by acquisition, I made it a point to meet with the suppliers of my raw materials to my company. And I would meet with them periodically, those salesmen, and I would tell them, if for any reason you happen to come across one of my competitors or a complementary product line company and you find out that it's for sale, if you'll let me know, I'll make it worth your while. And on a half a dozen occasions over the course of my business career, I've had to write checks for $5,000 to $10,000 to salesmen who called on me to sell me my raw materials because they turned me on to a business that I originally bought or eventually bought. And that's part of making it a win for everybody. See, everybody has to participate in your plan. You create a win for them so that when they do what you want, they're going to win. And so I created a win for those salesmen who supplied me with my raw materials, and I wrote them some very substantial checks in honoring those agreements. But what happened to me is one of those salesmen came to me one afternoon, and he says to me, "Have you heard what's going on at Jack's facility?" Now, Jack was my largest competitor in the front-end fork tube business. And I said, "No, what's going on?" He says, about a year ago, Jack started a new division of his company, making spoke wheels, real spoke wheels for big American cars. And the product has taken off, and he's going crazy down there trying to fill orders. He can't keep up with the tremendous amount of business that's coming in that new division. So I thanked him for that information. And I called up Jack and I told him that I heard his new division was doing really outstanding and that he was having trouble getting all of his orders filled, and that I had an idea that I wanted to talk to him about on how it was that he could fill all those orders coming in. Now I want to stop there and make a point. See, I didn't ask Jack to do something that was good for me, did I? I told Jack I had an idea about something that would be good for him. That's why he wanted to see me. So it's again, everything you do in business is focusing on where is the other person going to win and demonstrating to that other person their win. I made an appointment to meet with Jack. We met for lunch, and during the course of lunch, I asked Jack to take a few moments and figure out what kind of a return on investment he earned in the company that competed with me. And he takes out a napkin and his pen and he starts writing down and figures out what it is. And I says, I know competitors don't like to talk about that information with each other, so don't tell me what the return on your investment is, just write it down. And then I said, okay, Jack, now how much do you earn as a return on investment in all the money you have invested in your new company, your new division? And figure that out, write it down, don't tell me what it is. And so he did that. And then I asked him, okay, Jack, how much bigger is the second number than the first number? And he says about 3 times. So in other words, Jack, you're earning 3 times the profit on every dollar you've got invested in your spoke wheel company. You're earning 3 times the amount on that investment than you are on every dollar you have invested in the company that competes with me. And he says, that's right. So in other words, Jack, if you could take all the cash that you had invested in the business that competes with me, and you could free that up, and then take that cash and reinvest it here into your new business so you could fill all those orders that you've got, then you could earn 3 times the amount of profit on those dollars by investing them in the new company than you can by keeping them in the old company that competes with me. And he says, that's right. And I said, well, Jack, I got a great idea. Why don't we go back to your facility? We'll go through your facility. Let's see if we can't come to an agreement whereby I will buy from you your existing fork tube company. I'll pay you all cash for it, and you can take that cash and redeploy it back into this new company and make a lot more profit for yourself. And he thought that was a dandy idea. So we went back to his facility, and for those of you who want to follow along in the numbers with me, if you're in the workbook, you can turn to page, I believe it's M7. No, it's not M7. It starts on M7. It's called variation number 1, how to buy out your competitor using his customer's money. But the figures, you can follow them along on M8. Now what we did is we went back to Jack's facility, and we looked over his machinery and equipment, and we came to an agreement that it basically had a fair market value of about $100,000. Now, it was relatively easy for Jack and I to come to an agreement as to what the fair market value of the equipment was, because being competitors, using essentially the same type of equipment, I knew pretty much what the equipment was worth. He knew pretty much what the equipment was worth. So it was not very difficult for us to come to a meeting of the minds on a reasonable fair market value for the equipment. We also agreed that if he were to spend the next 2 to 3 months gradually liquidating that equipment off, not a forced sale, not an under the hammer auction, but just a gradual liquidation of that equipment over 2 or 3 months, finding good buyers for it, that he could probably get $80,000 for the equipment. I agreed to purchase the equipment from him and move it to my facility, because he wanted to get it out of his facility so he could move spoke wheel manufacturing equipment into that area. I agreed to move it to my facility and pay him $90,000 for the equipment. Then we went into the warehouse and we looked over the inventory. And again, Jack's costs of manufacture were not very much different than my costs of manufacturing those fork tubes. So in terms of coming up with an agreement on the inventory, it was pretty easy for us to do that too. He knew what it cost him to produce the inventory. I know what it would have cost me to produce the inventory. The figures weren't a lot different, and we both agreed that the inventory had a fair market value. In other words, it would cost to produce that inventory approximately $50,000. We also agreed that if Jack were to go out of the fork tube business on his own, just shut the place down, and try to liquidate off that inventory, that he would be lucky to get $30,000 for it, which would be below his cost. And the reason for that is a fork tube is a precision part. It's ground to very tight tolerances because it's a hydraulic tube. The threading at the end is precision threading. And if for any reason the threading isn't right or the tolerance isn't perfect, to within tens of thousandths of an inch, then the tube's no good. And whoever distributor bought that would want to be able to return it to the manufacturer for credit or a replacement. Well, if he's out of business, no one's going to be standing behind the fork tube, so he could only get, in effect, a liquidation value for it, which reflects the fact that there's nobody to return it to. So we agreed that if he were going to just liquidate out his inventory, he only could have gotten $30,000 for it. So I agreed to pay him $40,000 for the inventory, and I would stand behind his inventory when I sold it to my customers. So if there were any bad parts in there, I'd have to either regrind the tube or whatever it would take to make it right. The accounts receivables that he had in the company were approximately $50,000 fair market value. If for any reason he went out of business, not everybody who owes you money when you go out of business pays you, because if you're out of business, you go right to the bottom of the priority list. They use their money to pay other suppliers that are still delivering to them. So as a result, very difficult to collect your receivables when you close down a company. So he would have been lucky if he had shut down the company to get $40,000 for the receivables. I agreed to pay him for his receivables the full face amount of his receivables, $50,000, because he agreed to guarantee them. In other words, if for any reason I couldn't collect them by the end of 90 days, then I could give them back to him, he'd worry about them, and I would get paid from him the full face amount. So as long as he was willing to guarantee the receivables, I gave him full face amount on the receivables. Now, the payables of his company were approximately $20,000, and interestingly enough, they were to a lot of the same suppliers that supplied me. So I agreed as part of the purchase, I would assume his trade payables. I would become responsible for him. He would no longer owe them. So if we now take the fair market value of all the assets and subtract the liabilities, we're looking at a value on the hard net worth of this company of $180,000. If we take the liquidation value of all the assets and subtract the liabilities, we're looking at $130,000 as the liquidation value. I agreed to purchase the company from Jack for $160,000. And in addition, I agreed to pay Jack an additional $5,000 because he was going to sign a covenant not to compete. Now, why did I want him to sign a covenant that he would never compete with me or would not compete with me for 7 years from the date of the purchase? Because I didn't want to buy his business, have him be super successful in the wheel business for a few years, only to find out that that was a fad and petered out, and then have him take all that money that he made in the wheel business and use it to come back in and compete with me again in the fork tube business. I wanted to know once I bought him out, I never had to worry about him again effectively as a competitor. So he agreed to sign a covenant not to compete, and we put an arbitrary value on that of $5,000. So I agreed that I would buy Jack's company from him for $165,000 cash. Cash. Does that sound like me? Sure doesn't. So let's see what I did. The key to this transaction is Jack's inventory. The inventory that cost him $50,000 to produce, he wouldn't sell it to his customers at $50,000 because he couldn't make any money that way. He sells it at the wholesale price. That's his manufacturer's cost. But when he sells it at the wholesale price. And the wholesale price is going to be marked up substantially. So his price to his distributors for that inventory would have been approximately $75,000. Now, what I did is prior to completing the purchase of Jack's company, I went to his 2 largest distributors. And the reason I know who knew who those distributors were is that they were 2 of the largest distributors in the country that weren't buying from us. We had been trying to sell them for the 2.5 years that I'd been running the business, and they wouldn't buy from us because they were very loyal customers of Jack's. And so I knew who they were, and I went to them and I told them I was buying Jack's company. And I told them that I wanted to make them a one-time only deal that would be a super win for them. Does that word sound familiar? Yeah. So he says, and the reason I want to stress this is I want you to see how every deal hinges on creating the win for other people when they do what you want them to do. So I go to Jack's 2 largest customers and I tell them that I'm buying Jack's company and I want to make them an outstanding one-time only offer. I tell them that I'm buying Jack's inventory and I show them a log of the inventory and what it is. And I tell each one of the distributors that I want each one of them to buy from me on the day I buy Jack's company half his inventory. And if they will do this, terms to be, cash, FOB, point of manufacture, that if they will do this, I will give them a discount on that inventory of 20%. Now, do you know what a 20% discount is to a distributor? They kill for those kind of discounts because what it means is they can now discount by 20% off of their price to their customers and move that inventory very quickly through their system. So that's a phenomenal opportunity for them. And I had got both of Jack's distributors, 2 of his largest distributors, to agree to, on the day I bought Jack's company, to pull up 2 trucks to Jack's warehouse. And on the day I buy Jack's company, I'm going to be loading right from his warehouse right onto the trucks of his 2 largest distributors, hit Jack's inventory, which I'm going to sell at $75,000 less 20%, or in other words, I'm going to be selling it for $60,000. So where am I getting $60,000 of the money I'm using to buy Jack's company? I'm getting it right from his 2 largest distributors right on the day that I buy his company. I'm going to be loading it right onto his trucks. I will never actually myself physically take possession of that inventory. It will go right to his 2 largest customers. Now, at the time that I put together this transaction in my original company, I was financing my accounts receivables with Aetna Business Credit. And I called Aetna Business Credit and I said to him, I'm buying out my competitor. And when I buy his company, I'm going to be taking over his accounts receivables. And you finance my receivables now, and you finance them at 80% of the eligible receivables. And when I buy Jack's company, his receivables are going to become my receivables. Can I, that day, package up all of the receivables I'm buying from him and ship them off to you and put them under our original agreement? Because once his receivables are my receivables, then I can just pledge them to you and raise 80% on them the same way I do on my own ordinary receivables. And I thought that was a fine idea. They're in the business of financing receivables. As long as they're going to be my receivables, they have an agreement with me, sure, they're happy to do that. So I now know that when I take over Jack's $50,000 of receivables, that day I package them off, send them off to Aetna Business Credit, and Aetna Business Credit is going to credit my credit my checking account $40,000, 80% of that $50,000. So now I know where $40,000 more of the money is going to come from to buy Jack's company. Now, at the same time I'm talking to Aetna Business Credit on the receivables, I tell them that when I buy Jack's company, I'm also going to be buying his machinery and equipment. They currently finance my machinery and equipment at 80% of its liquidation value. And when I own Jack's machinery and equipment, I want to know if they'll do the same on that. They said, sure, we just need to send an appraiser over there to see if the value is there. And if the value is there, sure, we'll be glad to finance that for you at 80% of the liquidation value. They send over the appraiser. They basically agree with the figures that Jack and I had put forth as the liquidation value of the equipment. And Aetna Business Credit, on the day that I buy Jack's company, is going to write me a check. I'm going to sign a UCC filing and pledge agreements to pledge those machine and equipment to them. So on the day that I buy Jack's company, I'm going to be financing the machinery and equipment at 80% of its liquidation value, or $64,000. So if we add up the 60, the 40, and the 64, on the day I buy Jack's company, I know where I'm going to be getting back $164,000. I'm paying $165,000 for the company, so it means that all I need to be able to buy Jack's company of my own money is $1,000. And within the first 30 to 45 days after I bought Jack's company, I had that $1,000 back in my pocket several times over. And the reason for that is I didn't need all of Jack's equipment. I took a couple of the key pieces of equipment, some pieces that he had that were better equipment than what I had. I moved that into my facility, and the rest I put in storage, temporary storage. I went from one shift at my plant to 2 shifts at my plant. Now I can produce all of what I needed to produce to satisfy both customer bases. And I have that surplus equipment that I now orderly sell over a period of 2, 3, 4 months. Well, I eventually sell it all. Every time I sell a piece, I got to take 80% of the money and give it to Aetna Business Credit because they've financed it. But 20%, and in some cases more, because I sold it for more than its liquidation value, the 20% differential always would be coming back to me. So that easily overcame that $1,000 and turned that into a plus over a period of a few months. So I actually ended up with cash plus in my pocket as a result of it. But at the time that I did this transaction, my original company was the largest producer of front-end fork tubes in the United States. We had about 35% of the marketplace. Jack's company was doing a little less than 25% of the marketplace. So between the two companies, I'm now doing 60% of the front-end fork tubes in the United States of America for motorcycles. And once I complete that transaction, what do you think my very first thing that I do is? Very first thing that I'm going to do. Very good. I'm going to increase my price. Because anybody in the country who buys in quantity has to buy from me because I'm the largest supplier out there. So I increase my price, not a lot, 3, 4%, 5%, that's all it takes, because that's all profit, isn't it? I mean, that goes right to my bottom line, the whole thing, okay? So the reality of it is it represented a very substantial increase now in my cash flow of my business and the profits of my business, and with that increased price and that increased margin, increased cash flow, do I have any problem now meeting any of the debt reduction that I have to buy either one of my, in other words, on either one of my two companies? No problem at all. Now, there was only one other significant manufacturer out there in front-end fork tubes. The rest were little garage shops all over the country that were literally non-factors in the industry. There was one more manufacturer who was doing around 20% of the industry. So between the three of us, we had 80% of the aftermarket tubes in the United States. So after I completed the purchase of Jack's company, what do you think my next move is going to be? I'm going to go after the other manufacturer. Okay, now, he was not a motivated seller because he didn't have another business he could go redeploy those assets in and create a bigger win for himself. So him, I had to pay a slight premium for his business. I had to pay him a little more than it was technically worth. But when I was willing to pay him more than it was worth, he became a seller, and I bought him still with no cash because I leveraged all of his assets to give him his down payment money, and the premium that I paid him was in the form of payments later on. Now, let me share with you a little key here. My company and Jack's company were West Coast companies. He was in Gardena, I was in Van Nuys. This other person was in Richmond, Virginia. A fork tube is a heavy product. And in order for us to compete with him on the East Coast, we had to eat the freight. In order for him to compete with us on the West Coast, he had to eat the freight. And so as a result, the freight was really eating up a very big piece of the margin anytime we had to go coast to coast. When I bought his company, we now deliver all East Coast orders out of the East Coast plant. We deliver all West Coast orders out of the West Coast plant. And we figure out in the middle which one's going to have the cheaper freight rate. And the very small premium that I paid for that buying that third competitor was easily overcome by the savings in freight alone. In other words, we paid for the entire payments on the third company right out of the freight savings of the two companies. But after I buy the third company, what do you think I do one more time? Raise prices a little bit more. Now, there's a limit to how far I can raise them, and the limit is this. If I raise them too high, the dealers will no longer buy fork tubes from an aftermarket producer. They'll go back to the original equipment manufacturer, Honda, Harley, Suzuki, Kawasaki, any of the motorcycle manufacturers. The reason people buy aftermarket product is because the original equipment manufacturers have outrageous prices on all their replacement parts. Okay? So there's a limit to how far I can go before I then start forcing people back to the original equipment manufacturer. But I raised them another 4 or 5%, and so now I have outstanding margins. I have tremendous freight savings. I have margins built into my business now that are incredible margins in the motorcycle aftermarket business. I have the best margins in the country for any product out there, and I have the finest distribution system in the entire motorcycle field because every dealer in the United States has my product on their shelves. Now, there are no more competitors for me to buy because I don't want to go and buy these little tiny garage shop operations that are doing the other 20% of the market. So I have no interest in those whatsoever. They're just there and they can stay there. What do you think my next step is going to be? Next step is going to be to buy other companies that are complementary product lines. I made motorcycle fork tubes, so now I want to buy companies that make kickstands, handlebars, crash bars, luggage racks, seat backrests. Now, what type of company do you think that I'm going to be looking to buy? There's a very specific profile of a company that I'm going to be looking to buy based on what I've got. Let's ask some questions of ourselves so we start to see the process. Do I want to buy a company and pay top dollar for it? Or do I want to buy a company I can buy at a bargain? I want to buy a company I can buy at a bargain, but a company's only a bargain if it's for sale for the right reason. So I want to buy a company that has something wrong with it that'll mean it'll be for sale at a bargain, and I want that thing to be wrong with it, something that I can fix immediately. What problem could a company have that I could fix immediately? Distribution. Okay, because I'm in every dealer in the United States. And so if a company had bad marketing, good product, good quality control, good everything else, but the reason it's in trouble is because they never had good marketing behind the company, then that's a problem that I can take and plug right into my distribution system and fix that problem very, very quickly. So that's the profile of the company that I'm going to be looking for. And within a few months, I identified a company called National Recreation Products who was making luggage racks, handlebars, kickstands, all of those essential product that was in bankruptcy. And the reason it was in bankruptcy is they had a great product, good quality control, bad distribution. I bought that company, and later on in the seminar, when I get into the section on bankruptcy, I'll show you exactly how it is that I bought that company out of bankruptcy. But I bought that company, I plugged it into my distribution system, and within a few months, we had it past break even into substantial profits because we were able to fill the void of giving that company the distribution base that it needed for the product line that it had. Okay, now, that's what I mean about a strategic plan. A strategic plan takes into account not only how it is that you're going to get into your business, but once you're in your business, how are you going to go about expanding your profit margins? How are you going to make that business more profitable than when you walked in the door? And how are you going to take over a bigger market share? How are you going to increase your margins? How are you going to make that business more profitable? How are you going to expand it, whether it's through acquisition or new product development? In other words, a strategic plan takes into account all the elements of how you're going to take and make that business substantially more profitable. Now, at the time that I had purchased several companies, beyond this National Recreation Products, I bought a lot of other companies. My company had one of the highest margins in the industry. It had the best distribution system in the industry. And at that point, a major conglomerate who was interested in getting into motorcycle accessory parts in a big way, they were a company that already produced other products that went into motorcycles. They produced helmets, they produced fairings, most of which were fiberglass related products. And they wanted to get into the metal fabrication area. And they identified my company as a key target to buy because with my distribution system, they could put their helmets, their fairings, all into my distribution system. And they paid me a tremendous premium for that company because of what it represented to them. So that's how I got in, that's how I built up the company, that's how I got out with a big score. And what enabled me to get out for that big score was the intrinsic value that I built into that company by a procedure of acquiring the right companies to make my company into what I knew would give it value. So that's essentially how it is that a strategic plan evolves. And for your business, what you're going to become is a strategic thinker. You want to think about how can you take whatever business you're in and create a similar, it won't be identical, it may have lots of differences, it's okay, but it's going to contain the elements that we just discussed here today. And it's going to help you to run your business as a more profitable company. You're going to become a success thinker instead of a survivor. Instead of somebody who just kind of waits and see what the world's going to do to you so you can respond to it, you're going to think in advance and pre-plan what it is you want to happen, and you're going to use the tools that you're learning here this weekend to start making it happen for you.